The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a conflict that spanned from 1969 to 1998, had deep-seated roots in centuries of political, religious, and social division. The origins of the conflict date back to the partition of Ireland in 1921, when the island was divided into the independent Republic of Ireland in the south and Northern Ireland, which remained part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland, with its Protestant majority, became a region marked by tension between the predominantly Protestant Unionists/Loyalists, who wanted to remain under British rule, and the Catholic Nationalists/Republicans, who sought unification with the Republic of Ireland. The Catholic community, feeling marginalized and discriminated against in housing, employment, and political representation, began a civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Inspired by global movements for equality, organizations like the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, demanded fair treatment and reforms. However, peaceful protests were often met with hostility by the Protestant-dominated police force and Unionist politicians, who saw the movement as a threat to the status quo. Tensions erupted into violence in 1969 during events such as the Battle of the Bogside, a large-scale riot in Derry following a Catholic march, which became a symbol of resistance. The situation spiraled out of control as British troops were deployed to restore order, initially welcomed by Catholics, but soon viewed as occupiers when their presence became permanent. The early 1970s marked the escalation of violence into a bitter and sectarian conflict. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA, a militant nationalist group, launched a campaign of armed resistance against British forces and loyalist paramilitaries. Meanwhile, loyalist groups like the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, and Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, responded with their own violent campaigns, targeting Catholic civilians and communities. Northern Ireland descended into a cycle of bombings, assassinations, and brutal attacks, with civilians bearing the brunt of the suffering. The period was epitomized by Bloody Sunday in January 1972, when British paratroopers shot and killed 14 unarmed Catholic civil rights protesters in Derry. This tragedy galvanized support for the IRA and deepened the mistrust between Catholic communities and the British state. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a conflict that spanned from 1969 to 1998, had deep-seated roots in centuries of political, religious, and social division. The origins of the conflict date back to the partition of Ireland in 1921, when the island was divided into the independent Republic of Ireland in the south and Northern Ireland, which remained part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland, with its Protestant majority, became a region marked by tension between the predominantly Protestant Unionists/Loyalists, who wanted to remain under British rule, and the Catholic Nationalists/Republicans, who sought unification with the Republic of Ireland. This divide was not merely ideological. It reflected centuries of British colonization, settlement, and systemic favoritism toward Protestants, leaving Catholics marginalized and resentful. The Catholic community, feeling disenfranchised and discriminated against in areas such as housing, employment, and political representation, began organizing a civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Inspired by global movements for equality, organizations like the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, demanded fair treatment, voting rights reforms, and an end to systemic inequalities. However, peaceful marches often faced violent opposition from loyalist groups and the predominantly Protestant Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, who perceived the movement as an attempt to undermine Protestant dominance. Protesters were met with batons, water cannons, and even live ammunition, stoking the flames of resentment within Catholic communities. Tensions reached a boiling point during the Battle of the Bogside in August 1969 in Derry. Following an apprentice boys' march, a Protestant event seen as provocative, 3 days of rioting erupted in the predominantly Catholic Bogside neighborhood. Catholic youths threw stones and petrol bombs, while police forces responded with tear gas and physical force, turning the streets into scenes of urban warfare. The escalation of violence in Derry spread to other cities like Belfast, where Catholic homes were attacked and burned, forcing hundreds of families to flee. In response to the rapidly deteriorating situation, the British government deployed troops to Northern Ireland in an attempt to restore order. At first, British soldiers were welcomed by the Catholic community as protectors from loyalist violence. But this sentiment quickly turned sour as their presence became more oppressive, with house searches, arrests, and clashes increasing in frequency. By By the early 1970s, what had started as civil rights protests devolved into an outright sectarian conflict. Armed groups like the Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA, emerged to fight for Catholic interests and Irish unification, viewing the British military presence as an occupation force. On the other side, loyalist paramilitary organizations such as the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, and Ulster Defence Association, UDA, began targeting Catholic civilians to retaliate and intimidate. Northern Ireland became a tinderbox, with decades of animosity erupting into a prolonged and devastating cycle of violence. As the 1970s progressed, the Troubles became entrenched, with violence escalating and political solutions appearing elusive. Northern Ireland was plagued by daily bombings, shootings, and retaliatory attacks. The IRA intensified its campaign against British forces and symbolic targets, including a deadly bombing in 1979 that killed Lord Mountbatten, a member of the British royal family. Loyalist paramilitary groups, seeking to intimidate and retaliate, conducted vicious attacks on Catholic neighborhoods, often targeting civilians in a campaign of terror. The British government imposed measures to contain the violence, including internment without trial in 1971, which allowed suspected paramilitary members to be imprisoned without evidence. This policy disproportionately affected Catholic communities and further fueled resentment, driving more young men into the ranks of the IRA. Meanwhile, British troops patrolled urban neighborhoods in armored vehicles, creating an atmosphere of militarization that deepened divisions. In response, the IRA expanded its operations to mainland Britain, carrying out high-profile attacks such as the 1984 Brighton Hotel bombing, which targeted Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet. Amid the chaos, attempts at political solutions often faltered. The power-sharing agreement proposed by the 1973 Sunningdale Agreement failed due to opposition from Unionists, who rejected any role for Irish nationalists in governance. This collapse underscored the difficulty of finding a political settlement that satisfied both communities. Throughout the 1980s, the conflict seemed locked in an endless cycle of violence. Hunger strikes by IRA prisoners, including the death of Bobby Sands in 1981, drew international attention to the nationalist cause and inspired a new generation of activists. Sands' death while imprisoned became a symbol of resistance, further polarizing opinions in Northern Ireland. Loyalist and nationalist paramilitaries engaged in a grim tit-for-tat, with bombings and assassinations claiming thousands of lives, both combatants and innocent civilians. Communities became deeply segregated, with walls, known as peace lines, constructed in cities like Belfast to physically separate Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. A pervasive sense of fear and mistrust defined everyday life, as families lived in the shadow of violence, and young people grew up amid a society divided along sectarian lines. As the 1970s progressed, the Troubles became entrenched, with violence escalating and political solutions appearing elusive. Northern Ireland was plagued by daily bombings, shootings, and retaliatory attacks. The IRA intensified its campaign against British forces and symbolic targets, including a deadly bombing in 1979 that killed Lord Mountbatten, a member of the British royal family. Loyalist paramilitary groups, seeking to intimidate and retaliate, conducted vicious attacks on Catholic neighborhoods, often targeting civilians in a campaign of terror. Entire communities were engulfed in fear, and segregation between Protestants and Catholics became the norm, with physical barriers, known as peace lines, erected to prevent clashes in cities like Belfast and Derry. The British government imposed measures to contain the violence, including the policy of internment without trial in 1971, which allowed suspected paramilitary members to be imprisoned without evidence. This policy disproportionately affected Catholic communities, as hundreds of young Catholic men were rounded up and detained. Rather than quelling the violence, internment inflamed tensions further. Images of mass arrests, mistreatment in detention centers, and widespread rioting led to international condemnation and drove more young men to join the IRA. The events of Bloody Sunday on January 30th, 1972, when British paratroopers shot and killed 14 unarmed Catholic civil rights protesters in Derry, became a turning point. The massacre horrified the Catholic community, radicalized a generation, and swelled the ranks of the IRA, which vowed retaliation against British forces. The British response included the suspension of the Northern Ireland Parliament and the introduction of direct rule from Westminster, further alienating nationalist communities who saw it as a denial of their political agency. The violence was not confined to Northern Ireland. IRA operations spread to mainland Britain with devastating attacks, including bombings in London and Birmingham. In response, Loyalist paramilitaries escalated their own campaigns, targeting Catholic civilians indiscriminately. By the mid-1980s, the conflict appeared locked in a cycle of violence, with both sides unwilling to relent. Hunger strikes by IRA prisoners, particularly the death of Bobby Sands in 1981, highlighted the nationalist struggle and gained international sympathy for the Republican cause. Sands' death, after 66 days of starvation, turned him into a martyr and symbol of resistance, further polarizing opinions in Northern Ireland. Throughout this period, the conflict exacted a heavy toll on everyday life. Thousands of lives were lost, many of them innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of paramilitary attacks, British military operations, and sectarian reprisals. Communities became fortresses of identity, defined by painted murals, flags, and barbed wire. Schools, neighborhoods, and businesses were segregated, deepening the divisions that fueled distrust and hatred between Protestants and Catholics. Political progress seemed impossible, as successive attempts at power-sharing agreements, such as the 1973 Sunningdale Agreement, collapsed under the weight of Unionist resistance and ongoing violence. The Troubles, by the late 1980s, appeared to be an intractable conflict, a devastating cycle of bloodshed and political stalemate that defined life in Northern Ireland. By the 1990s, after decades of violence and thousands of lives lost, efforts to achieve a political solution gained momentum. A combination of fatigue from prolonged conflict, shifting public opinion, and international pressure created an opening for dialogue. Key figures and organizations on all sides began to recognize that a military victory was unattainable and that negotiation was the only viable path to peace. The United States played a significant role in facilitating the peace process. Political leaders such as U.S. Senator George Mitchell helped mediate discussions between the British and Irish governments, as well as representatives of Northern Ireland's political factions. Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, under leader Gerry Adams, gradually moved toward accepting political means rather than armed struggle. Likewise, Unionist leaders such as David Trimble began to consider compromises that had previously been unthinkable. In 1994, the IRA declared a ceasefire, followed by similar declarations from Loyalist paramilitary groups. Though the ceasefire was fragile and violence occasionally flared, the groundwork for peace was being laid. Years of careful negotiations culminated in the Good Friday Agreement, signed on April 10, 1998. This historic accord was a watershed moment, providing a framework for power sharing between nationalists and unionists in a devolved Northern Irish Assembly. The agreement also established commitments to disarmament, the release of political prisoners, and protections for human rights, ensuring that all communities were represented and respected. The Good Friday Agreement was ratified through referendums in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, reflecting overwhelming public support for peace. While challenges remained, the agreement marked the official end of the Troubles, bringing an era of relative calm after 3 decades of turmoil. Northern Ireland's transition from violence to a fragile peace was a testament to the resilience of its people and the power of diplomacy over conflict. The legacy of the Troubles remains deeply embedded in Northern Ireland's society, with memories of loss and division still shaping its communities. Yet, the Good Friday Agreement offered a path toward reconciliation, demonstrating that even the most entrenched conflicts can find resolution through dialogue, compromise, and a shared commitment to peace. By the 1990s, after decades of violence and thousands of lives lost, efforts to achieve a political solution gained momentum. A combination of fatigue from prolonged conflict, shifting public opinion, and international pressure created an opening for dialogue. Key figures and organizations on all sides began to recognize that a military victory was unattainable and that negotiation was the only viable path to peace. This realization did not come easily. Deep mistrust between nationalist and unionist leaders, compounded by years of bloodshed, made the path to peace arduous. However, the growing frustration within Northern Irish society and the economic damage caused by decades of instability pushed all parties toward compromise. The role of international actors, particularly the United States, became pivotal in breaking the deadlock. U.S. President Bill Clinton played an important role, offering support to the peace process, while former Senator George Mitchell was appointed as a neutral mediator. Mitchell's patience, diplomacy, and ability to foster trust between bitter enemies helped establish a foundation for productive talks. Meanwhile, Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA under Gerry Adams, made significant moves toward embracing political means rather than armed struggle, despite resistance from hardliners within the Republican movement. Likewise, moderate unionist leaders like David Trimble demonstrated a willingness to consider concessions that were once unthinkable, such as power-sharing agreements. In 1994, the IRA declared a ceasefire, a major turning point that was soon followed by similar announcements from loyalist paramilitary groups. While sporadic acts of violence still occurred, the ceasefire signaled a growing commitment to finding a negotiated settlement. These developments were underpinned by secret talks and years of behind-the-scenes diplomacy involving both the British and Irish governments, as well as grassroots initiatives in Northern Ireland. People on both sides of the conflict, exhausted by decades of violence, began to voice louder demands for peace. Community organizations and religious leaders played critical roles in fostering dialogue and reconciliation, encouraging leaders to put the needs of the population above political divisions. After years of tense negotiations, a breakthrough came in April 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement. The historic accord provided a framework for peace based on power sharing between nationalists and unionists in a devolved Northern Irish Assembly. It included commitments to disarmament, the release of political prisoners, and the establishment of cross-border cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Crucially, the agreement acknowledged the legitimacy of both unionist and nationalist aspirations, while ensuring that any future changes to Northern Ireland's constitutional status would be determined by democratic consent. The Good Friday Agreement was overwhelmingly ratified in referendums held in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a testament to the widespread public support for peace. Though challenges remained, the agreement brought an end to the formal conflict and marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was not the end of division or tension, but it demonstrated that dialogue, compromise, and a shared vision for the future could triumph over decades of bloodshed. The Good Friday Agreement remains one of the most significant examples of conflict resolution in modern history, a symbol of hope that even the deepest divisions can be bridged.